What the f? So, for no particular reason, well, there is a reason, but I don't want to drop what it is just yet. Project that I've been trying to get pulled together and is taking way longer than I thought it would. But I want to talk about what I feel are some of the worst tropes in comic books. Now, before I get into these, a couple of things. First is, not every instance of the use of these tropes is bad. That is the nature of a trope. Sometimes they are applied well, sometimes they are applied poorly, sometimes with no consideration for what it means, sometimes carefully. But they are things that are overused in regards to how much value they actually have narratively. And even if something is a good idea, if you use it to death, it becomes a problem. And so some of these things that we're going to talk about are bad ideas in and of themselves. Most of them are perfectly serviceable on any given instance, but how frequently they get used, that's the problem. So if you watch this, don't at me with instances on every single one of these tropes that goes, well, this one did it right. Yes, I know there are times that did it right. Doesn't mean that the trope itself overall is automatically good. So, that established, and these are in absolutely no particular order. Let's start with no one in comic books is allowed to be happy. This is going to tie back into something that I'm going to bring up at the very end, but there is this belief amongst comic book writers that happy people are boring, are uninteresting, are devoid of story possibilities. And I will readily grant that someone who has, say, a stable home life doesn't have the opportunity for the same kind of drama that somebody whose home life is a mess does. It irritates me that this is so firmly rooted in comic books, because you'd think by now somebody would have just taken it up just as a writing challenge, if nothing else. So how does this actually pan out? Well, it means that with very few exceptions, pretty much all of which are grandfathered in from before this was a really firmly established trope, every relationship either is horrible inherently or ends horribly. Like I said, there are a handful of exceptions to this. Lois and Clark, Superman and Lois Lane, they're kind of an exception just because of how long they've been together. And there are a few others out there. But other than that, Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy, she has to die. Spider-Man and Mary Jane, they have a rocky relationship. They have a troubled marriage. They can't have a kid. Their marriage gets wiped out by the devil because he can't be happy. They have literally had plot points about the fact that if Batman was ever happy, he'd stop being Batman. So you can bet his relationships never work out. You always have these awful things happen to people in these relationships, or the relationship is just bad in and of itself. That's where, say, your Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne, your Ant-Man and Wasp relationships come in, where that's just a bad relationship, but they keep putting them back in it again and again, and then they're in it, then they're out of it. But there's this thing that nobody can be happy. And while I will, like I said, I will grant that it is easier to come up with conflict when there isn't stability, but it's frustrating to me that this has gotten applied even to side characters. Like, it's one thing when you have a main character and you want their life to be in a state of upheaval because of the story possibilities that generates. But they can't even have side characters, minor characters, because eventually somebody is going to come along and pull a Ralph and Sue Dibny. So, and here's another thing that is worth mentioning. I'm going to end up talking spoilers about various comic book plots and things, but most of these are pretty well known. So if you haven't read them already, I'm sorry. So, Identity Crisis, Sue and Ralph Dibny, the elongated man and his wife, one of the longest running happy couples, no trouble, no drama, and she gets killed horribly. Because, heaven forbid, we actually have a happy couple. But that feeds directly into the next one I want to talk about, women in refrigerators. Now, if you don't know what that term means, the term itself was coined by Gail Simone, actually before she was a comic book writer. If you don't know who Gail Simone is, she is an excellent comic book writer, written all sorts of stuff. She's written Wonder Woman, she's written Secret Six, she wrote Birds of Prey for a while. She's really, really good. And before she was a writer, she was a fan, she was a reader, and in response to a 90s era Green Lantern story, she started up, I believe it was a blog called Women in Refrigerators. And I'll explain the specific thing that is the reason it was called that, and then we'll expand out into the trope. So the reason it's called Women in Refrigerators is that in the 90s, the then current Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner, came home one day to find his girlfriend dismembered and stuffed in the refrigerator by a minor character that almost nobody cares about. A guy by the name of Major Force, for the record. Yeah. So, what the trope actually means, moving beyond where it took its name from, it is the brutalization of female characters in order to motivate male characters to action, either by sending them out on a quest for revenge, by breaking up a happy home, shattering their world so that, things can be all broken and dramatic again. And when those situations happen, when a couple falls apart, if somebody's going to die, it is almost always the woman. And when you have something like, again, to look at Identity Crisis, you have a woman brutally murdered, and you have rape show up as sort of a background to events. And there are women on hand. There's Wonder Woman, there's Zatanna, but by and large, the focus of the story is how this impacts the men around them. And there are other ways to motivate male characters than to stuff a woman into a refrigerator. I don't know if I actually said it in my review, but it's why I really hated what they did with Vanessa in Deadpool 2, because they fridged her. That's exactly what they did. And again, to say, oh, but that one's okay because... No, it's not okay because they undid it in the post-credits. They fridged her. It's what they did. It's one of the most deplorable and overused tropes in comics, and they applied it to the movie, and it was dumb. So we'll go on from that one. Next up, a couple more that are going to feed into each other. Clones! Clones and duplicates and robot replicas, etc., etc. All functionally the same thing. And honestly, you can almost put dimensional copies and time-displaced alternate versions in here with the same thing. A million versions of the same character. And this is this is bad for a number of reasons. First of all, it's frequently confusing because One of the things about comic books, pretty much starting around the 80s, getting in, and it really blew up in the 90s, was the interconnectedness of stuff. And I don't mean in the, grander continuity-driven universe way. I mean in the, we're going to drop something in this issue that will only make sense if you read this other issue of this other title, so that you don't just get to buy this one title every issue a month. You got to buy 5, otherwise you don't know what the hell is going on. This is why I stopped reading X-Men in the 90s. So the obvious example for how badly clones can go off the rail is the Spider-Man clone saga. It's right there in the name. But you had a copy of Spider-Man. You had a copy of Spider-Man who was revealed to actually be the original Peter Parker, and the one we've been following for decades was actually the clone. You then had a reversal on that because fans hated it. You had an imperfect clone named Kane. And then you had clones of other characters as well, and it just becomes a jumbled mess. And that feeds directly, and before I get to the next one, clones, there is potentially some value to be had, but by and large, it's just a really cheap way to overcomplicate the story. And off the top of my head, I really can't think of too many interesting things that have ever been done with clones in comics. I'm sure someone else would come up with something. I can't come up with much. At best, I've seen it was like that was perfectly functional. Other times, it just completely derails everything. So to put in what else that feeds into, retconning deaths. Clones are one of a number of ways that ends up happening a lot in comic books. Deaths don't last. So there are many ways that characters being dead gets retconned. There is the very obvious, well, there was no body, so they didn't actually die when we were told they died before. That's kind of the obvious go-to. You've got clones, which I mentioned. Very rarely that a clone shows up, rather that we find out whoever died was a clone. Over at Marvel, you have the life model Decoys. They're exactly what they sound like. They are robots, impossible to tell the difference between them and humans, that are allowed to die in the place of someone who is not dead. So, I can't even tell you how many times Nick Fury has died, and it turned out, nope, was a life model decoy. So you've got that. You've got some of the other stuff that I mentioned. You've got time displacement. You've got dimension shifting. You've got just flat out magic. Nobody ever stays dead unless their death is completely intrinsically bound to a character's existence. Like Uncle Ben can never come back. Batman's parents can never come back. I would have said Jor-El can never come back, but apparently he's alive again. Yeah. So characters never stay dead, and the ways and the means used to bring them back are so often so friggin' painful and laughable. I could honestly, I might at some point in the future, do a list of the worst retcons used to undo a character's death. I might work on that at some point in the future. So, this is a personal, absolute, I hate this. This was all part of my grand plan. I hate when villains claim credit as being the puppet masters for these massive amounts of wide-reaching events, far more things than they could ever have reasonably controlled or could have predicted would have happened the way they did. But for the plot to work, we have to assume that they have been in almost complete control of everything going on across multiple comic book titles for months, if not years. Again, Spider-Man's a really good example of this, as Norman Osborn, retcon death, came back and was shown to be the orchestrator of a preposterous number of things that went wrong in Spider-Man's life. This has become an oddly big trend in movies lately too. It was one of the things that was really terrible about Spectre, with the whole motivation that they gave for Blofeld and him being like, and I've been, messing with you all along. It's like, really? You had nothing better to do than to just sort of dick around with this one guy? And again, it's always an overextension. Like, to pull an example of how it can work, one of the things I really like about Gotham, especially the first season of Gotham, was I was really unsure for a very long time, and actually I have my headcanon, but the show didn't really confirm one way or another, whether or not Oswald, the Penguin, was just a master planner or the world's most ardent opportunist, because he kept, doing things and pulling moves, and he was obviously like really pleased with the results. And I was always like, are we meant to believe that he planned that all along? Or did he just jump on an opportunity? And the show actually didn't really offer a definitive answer one way or the other for a lot of it, which is good, because if he'd ever said, if by the end of the first season where he kind of ascends to, running crime in Gotham, if he had said, all of this was just as I planned, I would have, I don't know, I was going to say I would have thrown popcorn at the TV, but I don't eat popcorn when I watch from home. But that kind of stuff drives me absolutely nuts. And it happens a lot as the payoff to extended stories. Not always necessarily big events in comics, though sometimes those too. But extended story arcs usually climax in a villain coming forward and revealing that they had orchestrated, these months or a year plus worth of events. And every time I see that, I go, nope, don't buy it. Don't buy it at all. If you actually could exert that degree of control, you just would have killed this hero outright. And so you're either just overstepping a lie because you're claiming credit for stuff that there's no friggin' way you could do, or you have a complete misallocation of your resources, because if you could control stuff this tightly, you should be pulling off way more than you are. So moving on from that one, we have... Okay, so the hero to villain turn it's a bit of a classic. I don't know if it's as common as villains turning hero, but a hero going bad is not that in and of itself. I don't want to say is automatically a bad trope. However, there's one specific mechanism frequently used to instigate that I do think is a bad trope, because it's the laziest possible option. I'm mad, so now I'm going to destroy the world. Again, to pick I think the most pertinent example, Hal Jordan. Now, to be fair, with him, this was in the 90s this happened. The 90s are coming up a lot in this. Can't imagine why. So, in the 90s, his home city was just leveled completely. Everybody was killed. And he snapped after that. He murdered almost every other Green Lantern, took their power rings, became this massively powerful villain. And to their credit, they didn't just kill one person and have him snap. They did kill his whole, this entire city that he lived in, that his loved ones were in, that he was responsible for. And that is bigger, and that helps. But they still it goes from the people I love are gone and now I'm angry and sad about it to I'm going to destroy the friggin' universe. Yeah, that's a bit much. And fans and eventually writers agreed, because eventually got retconned that he was possessed by giant fierce space bug. And it wasn't just that he went mad, but that kind of thing happens a lot. And for some reason, all the examples I can think of are in DC. I'm not going to say that DC does it more often, but you had Hal Jordan, you've had Mary Marvel, you had Superboy Prime, and it's always the lengths at which they go to completely disregards who they were before they became a villain. Because I can buy that someone who has been fighting the righteous fight, the good fight, can go bad. I can even possibly, if you really do it well, buy that it was, to use the Joker's terminology, because of one bad day. However, when you have a former hero who spent years saving people and caring about others more than themselves, suddenly behaving in the exact same manner as your villains who have been villains from basically as soon as they could walk, for as far as we can tell, that is completely disregarding the history of the character. And so you're not actually doing anything with the fact that they used to be a hero. You just did it for the sake of the shock and the twist. And now they're just another villain like any other villain could be. And that stuff really annoys me. So I've got 2 left. Oh no, I've only got 1 left. And this one was a late edition. And recent events made me want to bring this one up. So this one is a little bit meta. It's not strictly speaking about the comics themselves, but it has to do with the lead up and the marketing around them. And that is when we get told, we being the readers and the audience, no, really, we mean it. So the most recent example, I had actually missed that this had happened. Well, I knew what was happening, but I missed the controversy around the issue. There was a couple things. So Batman 50 happened not all that long ago from when I'm recording this. And leading up to it, Batman had gotten engaged to Catwoman. And the writer, a guy by the name of Tom King, he was doing interviews and telling fans, yeah, we're really doing this. We're really going through this. I've heard the arguments about how having a stable home life makes characters harder to write for. I don't think that's true. I think it actually opens up, a whole bunch of new possibilities. And then we get to issue 50, which was supposed to be the wedding issue, and Catwoman leaves him at the altar because if he's happy, he won't be Batman. Seriously, that's her rationale. So the man lied to us bold-facedly. And this happens a lot. It's been happening for years. Another example from fairly recent history was when they did the whole storyline of Captain America being an agent of Hydra. Captain America being a Nazi, effectively. And the whole thing was the publisher, Marvel in this case, really drew a firm line like, no, we mean it, we're serious. This isn't an altered timeline, no one's warped reality, this isn't a what if, we mean it. Turns out at the end Red Skull used I believe it was the Cosmic Cube to warp reality and change it, which is what we all figured immediately from the beginning. And it's not the fact that when I say you, I mean you comic book publishers, who I'm sure are watching this. It's not the fact that you guys are going to return to the status quo. That's kind of the nature of superhero comic books. That could be its own thing that I could complain about, but that is literally every continually ongoing comic book that doesn't have an end game, which is the vast majority of them, especially when you talk superheroes. Eventually things return to the status quo. And when you do a big shakeup, eventually it's going to go back to the way it was. That's just what happens. Here's the thing though. We know that. You don't have to try and trick us with that. We understand that something is weird in the world when Captain America reveals himself to be an agent of Hydra. We know that after you kill Superman, he's going to come back. We know that when Doc Ock's brain takes over Peter Parker's body and Peter Parker's mind dies, that eventually Peter's going to regain control. Although I feel bad lumping the Superior Spider-Man in with this, because at least we got over a year worth of stories out of that before that got reversed. But it's the insistence, it's the bold-faced lying of like, no, we mean it, because you're afraid that if we know you're just going to undo all this later, we won't buy it. Because we'll go, well, it's not going to matter because the changes won't last. The thing is, you don't really want to be drawing our attention to that, because then we might realize, well, the changes never last. Wait a minute, why am I buying these at all? I'm going to find another hobby. But tricking us and lying to us, you guys are eating up a fair amount of audience goodwill. You know, we may or may not complain about the repetition, the patterns, the status quo, etc., but nobody likes to be lied to. So, stop. Would you please? And those are what I consider to be, I don't know, what was that, 7? Awful comic book tropes that you tend to run into quite a bit. So those are my thoughts. What are some comic book tropes, things that you see show up in comics a lot that drive you nuts and you can't stand? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Whatever your thoughts are, just keep them respectful even if you disagree with me. All right, I know people get passionate when it comes to superheroes and stuff. Just let's be civil. So there's all that stuff down in the description, links to all of it. Patreon's the big one, but there's a bunch of other stuff. If you care, you can look at it. You don't need me to list it. So until next time, this council is adjourned.